In the years before the sundering, when the lamps of Oralanth still burned their steady green beneath the mountain, Aveline Larkin was late again and running. She was small, even for one of the grove folk, and her wings had never grown as they ought. Two stunted things of gray and gold that could lift her no higher than a chair and were good for little but knocking manuscripts from their shelves. She kept them folded tight against her back as she went down the long gallery of the Athenaeum, past the reading alcoves where scholars bent over their work like herons over still water, past the tall brass orreries turning in their slow silence, past the shelves that rose up and up into the dark until the eye lost them. The whole underground city had been raised for this, for the keeping and copying and loving of books. Oralanth had no fields and no harbors. Its harvest was words. Ave loved it the way other children loved sun and open sky. She had been born to the green quiet of the elder wood above, but it was here, among the old vellum and the smell of oak gall ink, that she felt herself become large. Here, a girl too weak to lift a pail could hold the thought of a dead master in her two hands and carry it out again into the light. She had a manuscript under her arm now, borrowed from an alcove she was not strictly permitted, and she meant to have it back before the underkeeper noticed. At the copying desk she paused, checked that no one watched, and set her fingertip to the first blank leaf of her own little ledger. This was the one thing she could do that others could not. The thin gold thread of power her mother had passed to her, and no master had yet trained. She whispered the small unmaking she had taught herself, and a single line of the borrowed page came apart into its letters, hung a moment in the air like motes in a sunbeam, and settled onto her own leaf, copied true. It cost her. A sweat broke on her lip. Her stunted wings trembled. One line, and she was tired. Her mother could unmake a whole book and set it down again perfect, and be no more spent than from climbing a stair. Ave could manage a line, and only just. Someday, she told the ledger, and closed it, and it was in that moment that the first tremor came. It was not the mountain settling. She had felt the mountain settle her whole life, a deep and patient groan far below the city, and this was nothing like it. This came from above and from the wrong direction. A shudder that ran up through the stone floor into the soles of her feet and set the brass orreries ringing on their spindles. The green lamps guttered. For a heartbeat, the great gallery went dim, and in the dimness, Ave felt a cold she had never felt beneath the mountain, a cold that had nothing to do with air, the cold of a hand laid flat against the back of the neck. A scholar cried out somewhere in the stacks, then another. Then the sound was everywhere, the particular sound of learned and gentle people who have never in their lives been afraid, discovering fear all at once. Ave clutched her ledger to her chest and did not understand, and then, terribly, began to. She had heard her mother speak in low tones with the archmage Thaldwin, the storm-wise old Orin who had built these very halls and who, when Ave was small, had once lifted her to see a book kept behind glass and told her she had good eyes for a Larkin. She had heard the two of them say a name and go quiet. She did not know the name. She knew only the going quiet, and she felt it now in her own chest, the instinct of a small thing that the sky has gone wrong. The lamps failed a second time and did not fully return. Down the gallery, where the great doors stood open on the city's central well, something moved that should not have been able to move, and where it passed, the green light died and did not rekindle. Ave turned and ran the other way, toward the servants' stair and the long climb to the surface and the grove, where her mother would be, and her father, and where the world was still the shape it had always been. Behind her, the Athenaeum, the whole reason and glory of Oralanth, 10,000 years of patient words, began, very quietly at first, to come apart. The city died in a single night, and Ave lived to remember it only because her mother had already been running toward her before the first stone fell. They met on the servants' stair, Seraphine coming down 2 steps at a time with her staff shedding a fierce white light that pushed the cold back a little way, and Ave going up, and for one moment mother and daughter simply held each other in the dark while the mountain shook. "Your father is at the grove," Seraphine said. She did not waste breath on comfort. Ave would remember that, after, that her mother had not lied to her, not once, not even at the end. "We go to him. Keep behind my light. Whatever comes into the light, do not look at its face." They went up through a city already lost. Ave had walked these streets 10,000 times and did not know them now. The green lamps were dead. In their place, a colder radiance came from below, a gray seep of light that showed her things she would spend 3 ages trying to forget. Scholars she had known, upright now and walking wrong, their eyes gone to that same gray. The shapes that herded them, tall and thin and patient, that Seraphine's white staff light held at bay and no more. Where the 2 lights met, the air itself seemed to sicken. Ave learned that night what her mother's power was for. It was a wall. It had always been a wall, and she had never before seen the far side of it, and now she did. "Faster," her mother said, and her voice was steady, and only Ave, pressed against her side, felt how her hands shook. They came out at last through the high tunnel mouth into the elderwood, and it was worse in the open, because in the open Av could see how far the wrongness reached. The grove that her father tended, the old and gentle wood that had stood since before the city, was burning without flame. The trees were graying from the roots up, and in the heart of it, where the great oaks made a ring about the clearing, her father was making his stand. Alder Larkin was a grove warden, and his power was the slow green strength of growing things, and against the cold of the sundering, it was like holding back a winter with a handful of summer leaves. But he held. Ave saw him at the tree line, with his arms flung wide, and the last green light of the wood running up his body. And she saw the gray shapes breaking against him and being turned, one and another, while behind him the guardians of the grove, the deer that were not deer, the standing stones that had learned to move, fell one by one and did not rise. "Alder!" her mother cried, and he turned, and across the dying grove he found them with his eyes, and Ave saw his face change, not to fear, to relief. He had been afraid they would not come, and now they had come, and so he could do what he had already decided to do. "Take her to the name stone," he called. "I'll hold the grove. Sera, I'll hold it. Go." There was no time for more. There is never time, at the end, for the things one means to say. Alder looked at his daughter across the burning wood and said only, "Be brave, little bird," which was what he had called her since her wings first failed to grow, and then he turned back to the tree line and set his shoulders, and the green light poured out of him into the earth, and the earth answered. And for a few moments longer, the oaks held. Her mother pulled her on, into the clearing, toward the pale standing stone at its center, and Ave went, weeping, and behind her the sound of her father's power changed, thinned, and stopped. She did not look back. She had promised she would not look back. It was the last promise she ever made him, and she kept it, and she has never been sure whether that was mercy or the worst cowardice of her life. They reached the name stone as the pursuit came into the clearing behind them, and the necromancer came with it, and he called her mother by name as if they were old friends. "Seraphine," he said, "you always did run toward the danger. It was your worst fault. I told you so once. You laughed at me." He came into the clearing on foot, unhurried, and the gray light came with him and clung to him, and Ave, cowering at the foot of the namestone with her ledger clutched to her chest, could not look at his face and could not look away. He had been a man once. She could see that much. He wore the robes of a magister of the Athenaeum, faded now to the color of ash, and where his eyes should have been, there was nothing at all, only smooth gray skin, and yet he saw. He saw everything. He turned that eyeless seeing on her mother, and it was full of an old and patient grievance. "Corvain," her mother said, and put Ave behind her. So that was his name, Corvain L. The name Thaldwyn and her mother had gone quiet over. The name Ave had felt in her chest before she ever heard it spoken. "I have come a long way," he said, "and taken a great deal of trouble, and I find I am owed. You know what I am owed, Seraphine. You helped me reach for it. You climbed half the ladder at my side before your nerve failed you and you turned back and called it wisdom." His voice was almost gentle. "The gift is in your blood. It was always going to come to this. Give me the gold and I will let the little one live. I have no quarrel with children." Ave understood perhaps a third of it. She understood that her mother and this thing had once been friends. She understood that he wanted her mother's power, the gold anima, the wall builder's gift, the same thin gold thread that ran in Ave's own untrained blood. And she understood, with a child's terrible clarity, that he was lying about the last part. She should have kept still. She would spend 3 ages wishing she had kept still. Instead, because she was 19 and frightened past sense, and because she loved her mother and had exactly one small, useless power in all the world, Ave lifted her ledger and flung her cantrip at him. The little unmaking, the thread of gold, everything she had. It struck him and came apart against the gray like a wave against a cliff, and did nothing. Nothing at all, except that Corvain L. went very still and turned his eyeless face fully upon her for the first time. "Ah," he said softly, "2 of you." And there was such hunger in it that even her mother flinched. After that it happened quickly, the way the worst things do. Seraphine did not argue and did not bargain. She had perhaps understood, in the moment Ave revealed herself, that there was now nothing to bargain with, that a man who wanted 1 gold blood would want 2 the more, and would never leave a child alive who carried the gift he coveted. So she did the only thing left to a mother who cannot win and cannot flee. She turned her back on the necromancer entirely, which no one does and lives, and she knelt and took Ave's face in both her hands, and she was already beginning the working as she spoke, so that her last words to her daughter came threaded through with the rising light of the greatest spell the Athenaeum had ever set down. "Listen to me. You are going to sleep, and it will be long, and when you wake the world will be strange, and I will not be in it. That is all right. You will still be my daughter. Everything I am is going with you." The light was gold now, her mother's own gold, pouring up out of her and wrapping round the 2 of them, and Ave felt it settling over her like amber, like being held inside a single, unmoving instant. "Be brave, little bird. Be brave and be kind, and do not let anyone tell you what your own nature is. You decide that. Only you." "Mother," Ave said, and could not move her lips to say more, because the gold had reached them. "I love you," said Seraphine Larkin. "I love you, I love you." And the working closed. It was the Stillstand, an instant, frozen in time, the legendary stasis of the old masters, which stops a moment and holds it against all the years that would wash it away. Her mother spent her whole life to cast it. Every drop and thread of the gold anima Corvain El had come to steal, and in spending it, she put that anima wholly out of his reach and around her child instead. Ave saw, in the last unfrozen sliver of a second, her mother's face begin to age a lifetime in a heartbeat, saw the gold go out of her all at once, and then the instant closed over Ave like water over a stone, and she was inside it, whole and unhurt and unable to move or breathe or die. A single held moment with all the ages of the world locked out beyond its golden skin. Corvain El's cry of fury reached her muffled and far away, as if shouted through a wall of honey. His hands closed on the gold and could not break it, could not touch what was inside. She felt him try, she felt him fail. And then, because the mother's working had drawn its power up from the deep places of the grove and the mountain both, the exhausted stone above at last let go, and the mountain came down. It came down slowly, from inside her frozen instant. Everything was slow now for Ave. Everything would be slow for a very long time. She watched the roof of the world descend without haste, watched the grove and the tunnel mouth and the fury of the necromancer all vanish under a patient avalanche of rock that sealed the elderwood and Oralanth and the ruined Athenaeum and the small frozen shape of Aveline Larkin away together in the dark. Then there was only the gold and the dark beyond it, and time going past like a river past a stone on its bed. She could not count it. There was no counting inside the instant, but the river ran and wore at the golden skin of the working the way even the gentlest water wears at stone. And somewhere, across a gulf of years too great for grief, the great spell began. At last, and very gradually, to fail. When the stillstand broke, it broke all at once, and Ave came back into time like a swimmer breaking the surface. A great gasp of stale air, a body that had forgotten how to be a body, and pain, and the dark. She lay a long while on cold stone and could not tell how long. The clearing was gone. The grove was gone. She lay in a low cavern of tumbled rock, buried leagues deep, and where the standing namestone had been, there was only a broken stump of pale stone half swallowed by the fallen roof. The air was old. When she coughed, dust rose that had not been stirred in ages. Her body was wrong. She understood that before she understood anything else. She had gone to sleep 19 years old and frail, and she woke frailer still, wasted almost to nothing, her stunted wings gone brittle as dead leaves. And yet, under the frailty, there was something new, something vast and quiet and strange, a sense of the stone around her as though the rock were her own cold skin, and the little cavern her own held breath. She did not have a name for it. She reached for one and found instead, unbidden, a by-name settling over her out of the changed air of the world. The Ancient, it whispered, as if the deep itself had taken to calling her that in the long dark while she slept, and she did not know why, and it frightened her. And she was not entirely alone. When at last she made herself sit up, she found a book beside her that had not been there before. It was small and gold-bound and warm, the only warm thing in all that cold, and when her fingers touched it, it opened of itself, and across its first leaf a line of writing bloomed in her mother's own hand, in gold, and then faded, and she never afterward could recall what it had said, only that it had been kind. The book was not paper. It was not exactly alive, and it was not exactly a thing. When she wept over it, and she wept a long time, it warmed a little more, as if to comfort her. She did not have to be told what it was. She had felt her mother's gold anima poured out around her at the very end. She had lived 3 ages inside it. This was what was left. This was everything her mother was, made into a companion so that her daughter would not wake alone. Piper, she named it, for no reason she could have given, except that a name was the first gift she had it in her to give, and it seemed to like the name. The gold letters warmed under her thumb. With Piper open on her knees, she took stock of what she had, and found that her old scholar's gifts were all still with her and all subtly wrong. When she tried the little unmaking, meaning only to test it, she caught up a loose chip of stone and it came apart into gold motes as before. But this time it did not tire her, and this time the motes did not simply copy onto Piper's page. They hung in the air awaiting her will, and when she willed it, they knit themselves back together into a new chip of stone, whole and exact, a perfect twin of the first. Unmake and reinscribe. She had spent her whole youth able to copy a single line at ruinous cost. Now she took a thing apart and set down a true copy of it, and was scarcely tired at all. And the doing of it felt less like a scholar's careful craft than like breathing, like something the deep itself wanted her to do. There was more. When she pressed her palm to the cold cavern floor and wished, in her loneliness and fear, for something green and living, a patch of pale moss crept up between the stones to meet her hand and put out a faint silver glow. She had not planted it. She had only wanted it, and the deep had made it, out of her wanting. She did not understand, yet, what she had become. That mercy, at least, was left to her a while longer. She knew only that she was alive and buried and changed, and that some vast reservoir of gold anima had woken in her with the breaking of the spell. Far more than her small body could hold, more than her mother had ever wielded, welling up faster than she could use it. It brimmed in her and overspilled, and because it had nowhere else to go, it rose, seeking the surface the way water seeks the light, threading up through crack and fault and fallen stone toward the world above. She could not have stopped it if she had tried. She was too weak and too newly woken and too full of grief. So Ave did the only thing she could think to do with a power she did not understand. She gathered a single bright mote of it into her hand, the way a child gathers a coin, and she made a small wish over it. Let there be something good up there. Let me not be the last living thing in the world. And she let it go. It rose through the rock and was gone, and the great pulse of gold anima rose after it, and far, far overhead, where a poor frontier town slept over the buried bones of a city it had never heard of, the light of Oralanth reached the surface again for the first time in 3 ages, and broke upon a girl who was being beaten in an alley for a coin she did not have. Kestra had been hit harder in her life, but not lately, and not by 2 men at once, and not while she was already trying to keep hold of the stolen fee that was the only thing standing between her and a thief's brand.
"Give it here," Odo grunted, and put a boot in her ribs to help her decide.
She curled around the little purse and did not give it. She had learned that much in the Kalir reaches before the reaches burned, that a veil gives nothing to the men who kick her, that the giving is the whole of what they want, and the coin only the excuse. Her people had run a fighting hall once, her mother and father both, before the war came east and took the hall and the town and them with it, and left Kestra a refugee in a suspicious frontier hole where the word veil was a thing men spat. She had their art in her hands still, the 9 turnings, the soul and breath discipline that could put a grown man down with a touch laid in the right place. She had never once used it here. To use it was to be marked, to be feared, to be dragged before the reeve as a foreign killer. And a marked foreign killer did not live long in Halmar's keep. So she took the boots and kept her hands closed and her art hidden, and she bled quietly into the alley mud. She had stolen the fee for the namestone. Tomorrow the town held its calling ceremony, when those with the coin might go before the old stone and have it wake a calling in them, a true vocation with true power that would lift a person out of the gutter for good. Those without the coin got nothing, or worse than nothing. The slow default the poor were left to, the common calling that woke a life of scraping and never once a spark. Kestra had watched Crane's people mean to leave her to that, and then to press a thief's calling on her when the default failed, so that she would belong to the underworld forever. She had stolen the fee to steal herself back. And now Odo and Evo were taking it, and her, and the fee, and there was nothing she could... The light came up through the ground. It came up out of the alley cobbles, out of the stones themselves, gold and sudden and warm, and both men reeled back from it with cries. Kestra felt it pass through her where she lay, not into her clothes, not onto her skin, but into her, into the marrow, a heat like sunlight after a winter indoors. And for one impossible instant, the pain went out of her, and she saw, very clearly, a single bright mote drift down out of the greater light and settle over her heart and sink in. Then the light was gone, and the alley was dark again, and Odo and Evo were staring at their own hands and at her and at each other. "What was that?" Evo said. "What in the—" Kestra did not wait to discuss it. She came up off the ground faster than a beaten girl had any right to, and her body felt lighter than it had in years, lit from within, and she did not use the 9 turnings. She did not have to. She only ran, and left the 2 enforcers cursing behind her, and did not stop until the slum was 3 streets back, and her breath was ragged, and the strange warmth had settled into a low, steady glow beneath her ribs. She still had the purse. She looked at it in the dark and found she was laughing, quietly and a little wildly. She still had the purse, and tomorrow was the calling ceremony, and something in the deep of the world had reached up and touched her, and she did not know what it meant, but for the first time since the reaches burned, it did not feel like the world was only ever going to take. The calling ceremony was held in the yard behind the Reeves Hall, under a gray morning that could not decide whether to rain, and Kestra stood in the line of the paying poor with the stolen fee sweating in her fist and the strange warmth still glowing low beneath her ribs. She had slept little. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the gold mote sink into her chest, and each time she woke, she half expected to find herself changed, sprouting wings or turned to stone or dead. She was none of these. She was only Kestra, sore and hungry and outside in a line. And when the clerk took her fee and looked at her twice for the shape of her eyes and the wrong sound of her name, she stared back until he wrote her down. The namestone stood at the head of the yard on a low dais, a plain gray menhir with the worn look of a thing older than the town around it. One by one, the paying folk went up and laid their hands on it, and one by one, it woke in them what it would. A baker's boy got a hearth calling and wept for joy. A carter's daughter got a beast warden's and would never haul again. When Kestra's turn came, she climbed the dais with her heart going hard and pressed both palms to the cold stone. And for a long and terrible moment, nothing happened at all. And then the warmth beneath her ribs answered the stone, leapt up to meet it, and the namestone woke in her not the common default the clerk had plainly expected of a Vale gutter thief, but something the old records of Halmar's Keep had no ready word for. A calling slot, the guild would name it later, when they understood no better than she did. An opened door, a vocation waiting to be filled, lit from within by a gold that was not her own. The stone shivered under her hands, as though it had touched something it had not touched in 3 ages, and the clerk went pale. And Kestra came down off the dais lit like a lamp, and did not know why, and knew only that she was not to be a thief. The trouble was that a calling slot alone bought nothing. To make a true calling of it, to fill the door, one had first to survive a trial in the deep, and the Delvers Guild that chartered such trials would not send a lone Vale refugee down into the dark on her own. They put her instead into the party they had left over, the misfits and the unwanted, the ones no established company would take. There were 4 besides herself. There was Fen, a lean, quiet young man with the too pale skin and the strange gray-flecked eyes of the half-Orin, an outcast of the vanished scholar folk, who was a scout by calling and said almost nothing, but seemed to hear things the rest of them could not. There was Bran, a great slab of a Farron from the Highland clans, bare-blooded, who could take a bear's shape at need, and who grinned at Kestra when she scowled at him, as though her scowl were a fine joke and the 2 of them were already friends. And there were 2 the guild had clearly wished on the party as a punishment to somebody, a watch recruit named Nessa, all bristle and no bite, and a young lordling called Roderick Aumbry, second son of some minor house, who had bought his slot and his kit and his opinion of himself all at the same shop, and wore all 3 badly. "I'll not answer to a foreigner," Roderick informed the party generally, when the guild hand told them to sort out who led. "Nor to a beast, nor to a half-thing. My family has held—" "Your family isn't down the hole with us," said Bran pleasantly, and shouldered past him to the trap door, and that settled the matter of who led without anyone else having to say a word. The sealed underways ran beneath the whole of Halmar's Keep, old tunnels the town had bricked up long ago when things began to stir in them, and it was into these that the guild sent its trial parties, into the shallow dark where a first calling might be blooded on some low creature of the deep. They went down by lantern light, single file, and Kestra went with her hands loose and her breath ordered in the old way, ready to draw on the 9 turnings if she had to, and hating that she might. The thing found them in a flooded gallery 100 feet down. It came up out of the black water without a sound, a pale, blind bulk of a creature, all jaw and grasping limb, a low thing of the deep grown fat in the dark. And it took Nessa's lantern, and nearly took Nessa with it, and Roderick screamed and ran 3 steps the wrong way before his own legs betrayed him, and the party came apart in an instant into shouting and thrashing water and the certainty of death. And then the deep helped them. Kestra never forgot it, because it made no sense and because it saved her life. The pale moss on the gallery walls, which had given only the faintest glow when they entered, flared all at once into a clean silver light, so that the dark that had been the creature's ally became the party's, and they could see. The water itself seemed to turn against the beast, some current or eddy that was not there before pulling at it, unbalancing it. And when Kestra at last gave up hiding what she was and struck, one open palm laid flat against the creature's pale flank, the 3rd of the 9 turnings, the breath thief. She felt her blow land far harder than her thin arms had any right to make it land, felt it go into the thing like a spear, driven by that low gold warmth beneath her ribs that leapt out of her to meet the need. The creature convulsed and sank and did not rise. And in the silver moss light, Kestra stood gasping in the bloodied water and understood 2 things at once. that she was not the only power in this dark, and that whatever else lived down here had chosen to help them, not to feed. "That wasn't us," Finn said quietly. He was staring at the moss, at the water, at the settling dark, with his strange gray eyes gone very wide. "The light, the current, that wasn't any of us." He looked at Kestra. "Something down here wanted us to live." They found her not long after, deeper in, where the flooded gallery gave on to a dry chamber that should have been a dead end, and was instead a low hall of tumbled stone, lit all over with that same soft silver moss, and warm. In the middle of it, seated on a fallen block with a small, gold-bound book open on her knees, was the smallest person Kestra had ever seen. A slight gray and gold grove girl, with wasted wings folded against her back and enormous, frightened eyes, who looked at the 5 muddy strangers who had come blundering into her deep and, plainly terrified, said in a soft and oddly accented voice, "Please don't be afraid. I made the light. I only wanted to help." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Roderick had gone somewhere behind Bran, and then the great bare-blooded Farron crouched down slowly to bring his eyes level with the little creatures, and said, in the gentle voice of a very large man who has decided something, "We're not afraid. What's your name?" "Aveline," she whispered. "Av." "Bran," he said, and put out one enormous hand, and after a moment the tiny gray fingers laid themselves in it, and the whole shape of 5 lives, 6, bent quietly in that silver-lit chamber toward a new course none of them could yet see the end of. Kestra looked at the frightened girl who had reached up through the world to keep a beaten stranger alive, and she thought of the gold moat settling into her chest, and she said nothing at all. But she came and sat down among them, and that was answer enough. When they climbed back toward the light a long while later, they climbed as one company, and it did not once occur to any of them but Roderick to leave the little grove girl behind. They came up into Halmar's keep changed, and the town, which changed for no one, took no notice at all, and that suited Ave better than she could say. She had not meant to be found. For days after her waking she had crept through her buried domain in terror of everything, of the dark, of the dead she was sure still walked it, of her own strange new hungers, and when at last the delvers came blundering down into her shallows, she had nearly fled from them as from more of the horrors that had killed her city. It was only that they had been so frightened themselves, and so plainly about to die, that she had reached out to help before her fear could stop her. And it had worked. She had turned her light against the dark for them, and turned the water, and lent her strength to the Vale girl's strike without in the least knowing how. And they had lived. And then, instead of running from her, the great bear man had taken her hand. She did not tell them what she was, because she did not know. She told them only that she had been asleep a long time, that the fall of the mountain had trapped her below, that she had woken alone. All of it was true, and none of it explained the silver moss that grew where she wished it, or the way the loose stone of the deep seemed to arrange itself for her comfort, or Piper, whom she kept wrapped and hidden and did not explain at all. Finn watched her with his strange gray eyes and said nothing, and she was afraid of what he was not saying. In the weeks that followed, she made a life, which was the last thing she had expected ever to do again. Verona Holt found them first. She was the founding guild mistress of the Delvers Guild, a broad, plain-spoken commoner who had built her charter out of nothing and had an eye for the useful. And she looked at the ragged misfit party that had come back alive from a trial that should have killed them, and offered all 5 a place. Roderick had already gone home to his house to complain, and Nessa had drifted back to the watch, and so it was the 4 of them she meant. Kestra, whose opened calling slot the guild could not classify and had decided to call promising. Fen, whose scout sense was the keenest Verona had seen. Bran, who was worth 3 ordinary tanks and cost as much to feed. And little Ave, whom Verona could not place at all and took on trust, because the others would not come without her. Ave went before the name stone herself, at Verona's arranging, and the old stone woke a calling in her that the clerks argued over for a day. A scholar's calling, they finally wrote, of an antique and unfamiliar degree, and left it at that. Ave did not tell them that when she laid her hands on the stone, she had felt it recognize her, felt it lean toward her the way a dog leans toward its own master's hand, as though she and the namestone were kin, as though she had some claim on the granting of callings that a person ought not to have. She filed that away with all the other things she did not understand about herself, and she went down into the deep with her friends, and she began, without ever meaning to become what she was. For her power grew as she used it, and it did not grow like a scholar's. When the party cleared the shallow tunnels of their low creatures, Ave found she could take the fallen things apart with her unmaking and set down copies of whatever the delvers needed: a better blade, a truer bowstring, a copied coat of mail. And the copies were real and cost her almost nothing, and Piper recorded each as she made it. When they camped in the dark, she wished the moss to light, and it lit, and wished the tunnels safe, and they became, subtly, safer, the loose stones settling, the bad air clearing, the very shape of the deep softening toward those she favored and hardening toward those she did not. And things began to live in her domain that she had not brought there, small, silver-eyed creatures of moss and stone that crept out of the dark and would not harm her friends and seemed, when she looked closely, to be waiting for her word. A brood, though she did not yet call it that. Guardians she had not summoned, growing out of the deep the way the moss grew, out of her wanting. She was uneasy at all of it, and she was happier than she had been since the world ended, and the two feelings lived in her side by side. In the lantern light of the guild hall she sat wedged between Bran's warmth and Kestra's wary quiet and listened to Fen's few careful words and felt, for the first time in 3 ages, that she was not the last of anything. That here, in this poor, suspicious frontier town, over the grave of everything she had lost, a new small circle had closed around her, and meant to keep her, and that she would do a very great deal to keep them in return. She noticed, too, and could not help noticing, that as her domain deepened and her strange guardians multiplied, the guild began to send its novice delvers down into her shallows to blood their callings, as though the buried tunnels beneath Halmar's keep had become, the word made her cold whenever it surfaced, a good hunting ground, a safe deep, a place where a young delver might win a first fight and come home whole. A place, in short, that behaved in every particular like a wakeful deep, like a hollow, like the accursed, sapient places every child of the frontier was taught to fear and burn. Ave did not let herself finish the thought. But Finn, walking point through her silver-lit tunnels with his half-oran senses open wide, had already begun to finish it for her. Finn had known for a long time before he let himself know it, which is the way of the worst knowledge. He was half-oran, and the oran had been scholars of the deep before there were oran scholars of anything else. And though his mother's people had cast him out and his father's people had never claimed him, the blood in him read the underground the way other men read a friend's face. He had felt it in the flooded gallery on the first day, that the silver light and the turning water had a will behind them, and that the will was not any of theirs. He had felt it grow, week upon week, as Ave's tunnels softened and brightened, and filled with silver-eyed things that watched her with a dog's devotion. He had walked her deep with his senses open and felt what any trained scout would feel, and refused, for love of her, to name. He named it at last on a night when the four of them were camped deep, and Ave had fallen asleep against Bran's arm with Piper clutched to her chest, and her guard came down in her sleeping so that the deep answered her dreaming without her governing it, the moss pulsing gently with her breath, the stone leaning in around her like a mother's cupped hands, the whole vast buried dark holding her the way a body holds a heart. Fen watched it, and could not unsee it, and beckoned Kestra and Bran a little way off, out of the sleeping girl's hearing. "She's a hollow," he said. His voice was very low and very steady, and it shook only at the end, a wakeful deep. This whole place, the tunnels, the moss, the guardians, it isn't near a hollow. It is one, and Ave is its heart. Ave is the hollow. He looked at their faces in the dim glow and made himself finish it, because they had to understand exactly what he was telling them. "I've scouted for the guild 3 years. I know what I'm feeling. Every deep the church has ever burned, every wakeful place we're taught to put to the torch the day it wakes. She's one of those. That's what she is." For a long moment, none of them spoke. Bran had gone very still, the grin gone off his broad face. Kestra's hand had drifted, without her deciding it, toward the place at her belt where a blade would be. Every child of the frontier knew the teaching. A hollow was accursed. A sapient deep was a wound in the world that bred monsters and hungered for the living and turned, always, sooner or later, no matter how it began, turned cruel, turned devouring, became the thing that had to be burned before it grew great enough to swallow a town. There were no good hollows. There had never been a good hollow. The Church of the Radiant Dawn had 3 ages of ash to prove it. That was the whole of what they had been taught, all 3 of them, since before they could walk. And 10 feet away, a small gray grove girl slept with her mother's memory clutched to her chest, and her buried deep cradling her like a child, having done nothing in all the weeks they had known her but heal and shelter, and lend her strength to keep beaten strangers alive. Kestra took her hand off her belt. "No," she said, just that at first. Then, when Fen and Bran both looked at her, "Whatever the church says, whatever gets burned, I know what a monster is. I grew up among men who'd have sold me to one. I've been kicked half to death in an alley by good, honest townsfolk who go to dawn service every 7th day." She looked at the sleeping girl, and her hard, wary face did something it did not often do. It softened. "That's not a monster. That's the only thing in this town that reached up through the world to keep me alive when it had every reason to let me die. I don't care what she is. I care what she does, and what she does is good." "The teaching says they turn," Fen said, not arguing, testing, laying the worst of it out so that it could be answered or not. "It says they all turn, in the end." "Then we don't let her," Bran said. He had found his voice again, and it was quiet and certain, the voice he had used crouching down in the deep to take a frightened creature's hand. "That's the whole of it, isn't it? If they turn because they're alone, and unloved and hunted, then we don't leave her alone, and we don't stop loving her, and we don't let anyone hunt her. We keep her good. It's not a thing you're born and can't help. She said it herself, first day. She made the light because she wanted to help. That's a choice. So we help her keep choosing it." He spread his big hands. "She's ours. That's all I know. You don't burn what's yours. You keep it." And that was the covenant, made in a whisper over a sleeping girl in the dark under the mountain. 3 young outcasts of a world that had no place for any of them, choosing, against 3 ages of dogma and the settled faith of everyone they had ever known, that the accursed thing they loved would be an exception, and that they would be the ones to make it so. They did not swear it aloud. They only looked at one another and found the thing already decided in all 3 faces, and that was stronger than swearing. The harder task was telling Av. They did it the next day, gently, all 3 together, because Bran said no one should learn such a thing from a single frightened face. And it went as badly as they had feared, and then, slowly, better. Av already half knew. That was the mercy and the horror of it. When Fen said the word, hollow, she did not cry out or deny it. She went very white and very still, and Piper's gold letters flickered agitatedly on the page, and she whispered, "I know. I think I've known. I didn't want," and could not finish. She had felt the name stone lean toward her. She had felt the deep answer her wanting. She had lain awake with the by-name the Ancient whispering in her marrow, and had refused, night after night, to ask what a person had to become for the deep itself to call her that. Now it was said aloud, by a friend, in the light, and she had to look at it. "I'm the thing they burn," she said. Her voice was terribly small. "I'm the thing my whole life I was taught to be afraid of. I'm the same as him, as the one who killed my mother. He was a hollow too, wasn't he? Bound to a deep. I'm the same kind of thing that—" "No," Kestra said, harder than she meant, and knelt in front of her so their eyes were level. "Listen to me. I don't know what he was. I know what you are. You are a scholar who copies books and grows moss for light, and cried for an hour over a dead man's diary we found in the tunnels. You are the least monstrous thing I have ever met in my life, and I have met a great many monsters, and none of them looked like you." She took the small gray hands in her scarred brown ones and held them still. "The stone doesn't decide what you are. The church doesn't. He doesn't. Your mother told you. I heard you say it in your sleep. Only you. You decide." Ave looked at her, and at Bran's certain face, and at Fen, who had every reason of blood and training to fear her most, and had come to tell her the truth anyway because he would not lie to her. And something in her that had been braced for abandonment, braced for the torch, for 3 ages braced to be alone, let go all at once, and she wept. And this time, it was not only grief. "You still," she managed, "you know what I am, and you still—" "We know what you are," Bran said, and gathered all of them, the small girl and the lean scout and the hard-handed refugee, into the circle of his enormous arms without asking anyone's leave. "You're ours. Now you know it too. So, what do we do with a good hollow then? Because I don't think there's ever been one before. I think we'll have to work it out as we go." And Ave, wet-faced and shaking and held, felt the last of the old fear turn over inside her and become, unexpectedly, something almost like purpose. She was a hollow. She could not undo it and would not now if she could. But no one had ever chosen, before, what a hollow was to be. They had only ever been feared and burned before they could choose. She had been given 3 ages and a mother's dying gift and 3 friends who would not run. And she had, buried in her deep beneath her ruined city, the one thing no hollow had ever had. She had a library to rebuild. She had a whole lost world of words sleeping in the dark beneath her, waiting. And she was the deep that held them, and she could— She realized it all at once, and it took her breath. She could remember them. She could make the Athenium live again. "I know what we do," she said, and lifted her wet face out of Bran's shoulder. And for the first time since the mountain came down, there was something in her eyes that was neither fear nor grief. "I know exactly what we do. I'll show you. Come and see what I was sleeping on top of." What she was sleeping on top of was the Athenium, or the corpse of it. And when she led her friends down through the deep to the great buried gallery for the first time, even Fen, who felt everything and said little, stopped in the dark and could not speak. It went down and down. 3 ages of fallen stone had crushed the upper stacks and split the vaulted roof, and the green lamps were long dead, and the vellum had gone to dust in 10,000 rotted bindings. But the bones of it stood yet, rank on rank of broken shelving marching away into a dark so vast that Ave's silver moss, kindling as she passed, could not find the far wall of it. This had been the greatest library in the world. 10,000 years of patient words, her whole childhood's joy, and the reason her city had existed, and the thing Corvain L had come in one night to murder along with everyone she loved. "It's gone," Bran said quietly, looking at the dust. "Ave, lass, it's all. There's nothing left of it. It's dust." "No," Ave said. "It's here. It's all here. It never left." She could not have explained then how she knew. She only knew that she was the hollow now, and the hollow was the ruin, and the ruin remembered. Every book that had ever stood on these shelves had stood within her domain when it was whole. And a hollow's domain does not truly forget what it has held. The shape of a thing lingers in the deep the way warmth lingers in a stone after the sun is gone. She could feel them, all of them. A great sunken weight of vanished words pressing up faintly against the underside of her awareness. Unreadable, unreachable. There and not there. Remembered and lost. It took her weeks to learn to bring them back, and the learning nearly broke her. And it was the making of her. She began with a single book, a treatise on grafting that her father had loved, whose crumbled binding she found by the old horticultural stacks. She took the dust of it up in her hands and closed her eyes and reached, not with her unmaking, which could only copy a thing that still existed, but with the deep memory itself, the hollow's hold on what had been. She reached for the shape the book had left in her domain, and she poured her gold anima into that shape, and she tried to make the emptiness full again. The first time nothing came, and she wept with the effort and the failure both. The 10th time a page formed, one page, blank, and then, letter by agonizing letter as she strained after the remembered shape, filling with her father's grafting lore in a hand 3 ages dead. One page. It cost her everything she had and left her gray and shaking in Bran's arms for a day after. But it was real. It was true. The words were the true words, drawn up out of the deep's long memory, and when Ren read them later, he wept too, for a different reason. Ren was the bookseller, and Ave found him, or he found her, in the way of such things, over the matter of the very treatise she had raised. He kept a cramped stall in the town called the Nook, a shy, small-folk shopkeep who loved old manuscripts the way Ave loved them, and had a frontier town's worth of nothing to feed the love on. When word crept up from the guild that the strange little Grove scholar of Verona Holt's misfit party could somehow produce lost books, impossible books, books no copy of which survived anywhere in the world, Ren came down to the guild hall trembling with a hope he was ashamed to name, and Ave showed him the grafting treatise, and Ren read 3 lines of a text that had not existed anywhere on earth for 3,000 years, and sat down on the floor, and cried, and was her friend from that hour forward, and her partner in the work ever after. For it became a work, and then a calling, and then the whole shape of what Ave was. She grew stronger at it as she grew stronger at everything, until she could raise a book in an afternoon, and then a shelf, and then a stack. And Ren catalogued each as it came, and copied them again by hand into forms that could leave the deep and go out into the world. So that the frontier that had never owned a book began, slowly, to own books, real ones, whole ones, drawn up out of the grave of Oralanth by the small gray hollow who lived beneath the town and asked nothing for them but the joy of the giving. And there was a second gift she gave, greater even than the books, and it was the one that made the town love her before it ever learned what she was. She could grant callings. She had felt it at the namestone the first day, that leaning, that kinship, that improper claim. She learned in time what it meant, that a hollow of her particular nature had some part in the granting of vocations, that the namestone answered her the way an instrument answers a hand that knows it. And so, quietly at first and then not quietly at all, Ave began to do the thing that no coin and no clerk in Halmar's keep had ever done. She began to grant good callings to the poor. Not the common default that the town left to the penniless. Not the thief's calling that the underworld pressed on those it wished to own. Real callings. A hearth warden's for a slum widow who had never in her life been able to keep her children warm. A healer's for a crippled beggar. A smith's true fire for a foundling who had been going to be nothing at all. Ave laid her hands on the namestone beside theirs and lent it her gold, and the door in them opened, and their lives changed. She sought out the lowest and the most scorned to do it for. The refugees, the deep folk, the scale-born, all the world's discarded. Because she knew, better than anyone alive, what it was to be reckoned worthless and told your nature by people who had never bothered to look at you. A small cluster of them became her own. Havoc, a grund tunnel boy the whole town spat at, whom she gave a delver's true calling, and who would have died for her after. Sarn, Devon, a handful of others, uplifted and grateful and fierce in her defense. The town did not know she was a hollow. The town knew only that things were, unaccountably, getting better. The underways were safe to work. There were books in the nook. There were poor folk suddenly lifted who spent their new luck in the market and the tavern. Halmar's keep, sour and suspicious and stratified, began without quite noticing to prosper, and began, this took longer for they were a hard people, to be grateful, and to attach the gratitude, however grudgingly, to the strange small grove girl and her odd deep. Verona learned the truth in time, and Ave dreaded the learning and need not have. The guildmistress came down into the deep alone one evening, having put enough together, and stood a long while looking at the raised stacks and the silver-eyed brood and the small figure at the heart of it, and then she said only, in her plain, broad way, "So, you're the deep then, not just of it, you're the whole thing." And when Ave, trembling, admitted it, Verona was quiet another moment, and then shrugged her heavy shoulders and said, "You've done more good for this town in a season than the Reeves done in 10 years. I've buried better secrets for worse reasons. Yours is safe with me." And it was. She shielded Ave from that day, guided which delvers came down and which questions got quiet answers, put the weight of her charter between the little hollow and the world, an institutional loyalty as fierce, in its plain way, as anything the four friends felt. So the identity was made, in those weeks and months, that Ave would carry to the end. She was a hollow, and she was good, and she had proven a thing no one in 3 ages had believed could be proven, that a wakeful deep might choose to build instead of devour, to remember instead of consume, to lift the low instead of feeding on them. She had a restored library growing in the dark, and a town of grateful allies over her head, and 4, 5, 6, counting Wren and Verona, who knew what she was and stood with her regardless. She had, out of the grave of everything, made herself a home and a purpose and a people. And it was exactly then, as her reach widened and her name spread, and the deep beneath Halmar's keep became a thing spoken of further and further afield, that older and greater powers began to turn their attention toward the small gray hollow who was not supposed to exist. And some of them meant her well, and one of them, ancient and eyeless and patient, did not. The first of the great powers to come was the Dryad, and she came in the shape of an aunt. Lysen was older than the grove that had died. Older, she implied, than a good many groves, for she had been young when the world was, and had seen ages come and go the way Ave had seen seasons. She was of the green, the old folk faith of the mountain spirits and the growing dark. And she was kin to Alder Larkin in the long, slow way that trees are kin. And when she felt, across the healing land, the small, unmistakable signature of a grove child's gold anima where no grove child should have been, she came down through the deep places of the earth to find it. She found Ave and looked at her a long moment with eyes like sunlight in deep water and said, "Alder's girl. Well, you have his stubbornness and none of his sense, and you have grown into something the world has no word for, and I am going to have to look after you, aren't I? Because there is plainly no one else old enough for the job." And she settled in, gruff and immense and endlessly patient, and became to Ave the great aunt figure she had not known she needed, a mentor, an alchemist of terrifying skill, and a moral compass that pointed always, unwaveringly, toward mercy. She took Bran under her wing besides, the two of them forming an odd, fond pair, the ancient tree spirit and the great bare-blooded boy. And where Lysen went, a certain gruff troll named Gorm went also, ancient and rock-skinned and slow to speak, who had loved the Dryad since before Halmar's keep had a name, and followed her about the deep with the devotion of a mountain that has learned to walk. The second was the dragon, and he came because Ave went looking. She had grown strong, but she knew, now that she understood what she was, that she was untaught, that a hollow had reserves and disciplines and dangers she had learned nothing of, having had no teacher but the deep itself. And there was said to be, in the roots of the mountain far below even Oralanth, a thing older than the sundering, Vaskar, the old worm, a dragon of the deep places who had slept through the fall of empires and woken only rarely and to no one's good. Ave went down to him alone, small and frightened and carrying Piper. And instead of eating her, the old worm looked at her mother's gold anima made into a book, and at the buried library she was raising, and at the improbable good she was doing with the hollow's cursed power, and was, in his vast, ancient way, intrigued. He became her teacher. He showed her the deep disciplines, the husbanding of anima, the true nature and true peril of a hollow's bond to its domain, and he taught her, among much else, one lesson she would not understand the full weight of until the very end, that a thing bound to its deep draws power from that deep, and that the binding runs both ways, and that whatever can be poured out through such a bond can, in principle, be poured back in. And there was Syl. Syl was not a mentor. Syl was a sentient ooze the size of a large dog and the temperament of a small child, a translucent silver-blue thing of Ave's own deep that had oozed up out of the dark one day, attached itself joyfully to the little hollow it plainly regarded as its mother, and refused ever after to be parted from her. It could not speak, but it made its wants known, and its chief want was to be near Ave, and its second to be helpful. And it had one strange and particular gift that Vaskar remarked on with interest. An ooze could slip. It could pour itself through cracks too small for any solid thing, and more than that, An ooze of a wakeful deep could pour itself, on occasion and with effort, between one place and another, thinning out of the world here and reforming there, as though the spaces of the deep were less firmly separate for it than for anyone else. Ave thought it a charming trick. Vaskar filed it away and told her to remember it, and she did not know why. So the circle grew, the four friends at its heart, the mentors gathered round, Ren and Verona and the uplifted poor beyond them. And Ave rose through the degrees of her strange calling as she trained under the old worm, and the guild's rank rose with her party's deeds, iron to bronze and bronze to silver. And for a season it might almost have seemed that the story was one of quiet flourishing, of a wound in the world healed and a broken girl made whole. Then the revelation came, and it broke the season in half. It came, as such things do, from the edges, from the failing places. Word crept into Halmar's keep from the wider frontier of Dravenmark, of deeps gone wrong far to the east, of hollows that had never been benevolent turning worse, of the dead stirring in old barrows that had been quiet since the Barrow Wars. And with the word came refugees, and with the refugees came a name that reached Ave one gray evening and stopped her heart in her chest. Fen brought it. He had been listening, as he always listened, to the frightened talk of the incomers, and he came to her white-faced and would not sit. "There's a fastness in the far east," he said, "across the warlands, a place called Mordvale. The refugees speak of it the way the old stories speak of the thing that ended the world, a lord of the dead who has held it since before memory, who tears wounds in the world, rifts, they call them, veil tears, places where things come through that shouldn't be able to. His rifts are old, Ave, ages old, and they're failing now, breaking down, spilling worse and worse things onto the frontier, and that's what's stirring all the deeps and raising all the dead." He made himself look at her. "They have a name for him, the Sightless Magister. An Orin, they say, from before the Sundering. A scholar who traded his eyes and his soul for power in service to the powers beyond the wall." He swallowed. "Ave, I think it's him. I think it's the one who killed your family. I don't think he ever died. I think he's been sitting in Mordvale this whole time, and his ancient rifts are the wounds he tore the night he broke your world, and they're coming apart now, 3 ages on, and that's why everything is going wrong." Ave sat very still. Piper had gone cold in her hands, the gold letters stilled. She had thought Corvain L 3 ages dead, buried perhaps under the same mountain that had buried her, or withered into whatever a necromancer becomes when the world at last forgets him. She had built a whole life on the far side of his grave. And now Fen was telling her the grave had never closed, that the thing that had cornered her mother at the namestone and demanded her blood, that had watched Ave with such hunger and cried out in such fury when the gold closed over her, that it lived yet, and reigned yet, and that the horrors bleeding onto the frontier and stirring in the dark were the slow unraveling of the very wound he had made the night he killed her father and her city and her whole world. Something in her that had been healing for a season went hard again, and this time it did not feel like grief. Grief was passive. Grief was a weight you carried. This was something else. This had a direction. "Then he's not backstory," she said, and her soft voice had gone very quiet and very level. And Kestra, watching her, felt the hair rise on her arms. "He's not a thing that happened to me a long time ago. He's alive, right now, sitting in a tower in the east, and every horror crawling out of every failing rift on this frontier is his doing, still, after 3 ages." She looked up, and Piper's gold letters kindled again under her thumb, fierce and bright. He killed my mother. He killed my father. He murdered the Athenaeum and everyone in it. And he is still, right now, hurting the world I've been trying to heal. I've spent this whole season learning to be a good hollow. She closed the book gently. Now I'm going to learn to be a strong enough one to end him. For good. So he can never do it again to anyone. No one argued. Bran put one great hand on her shoulder. Kestra, who understood revenge in her marrow, only nodded, slow and grim. Fen let out a breath, and the ancient dryad, from her seat in the shadows, said quietly, "Then you had best let me teach you a great deal more than moss and books, child. Because a soul that traded itself to the powers does not die the way men die. There are old and terrible workings that bind such a thing to the world. Relics and bindings that keep a stolen soul from ever going where souls go. You will need to understand them before the end. I will begin teaching you tomorrow." She rose, immense and grave. "The war is yours now. So be it. We had all best get ready." And the circle, which had gathered for healing, turned as one toward the east, and toward the long labor of preparing for a war 3,000 years in the coming. The season of preparation was hard and dangerous, and it changed them all, and it laid in place, though only Ave and Leeson saw the whole shape of it, every piece the ending would require. They went into the failing rifts to grow strong, because there was nowhere else that would forge them fast enough. A rift close to was worse than any tale of it, a wound in the world's skin through which the outer dark bled, and the things that came through wore shapes that hurt to look at, wrong in their number of limbs and their manner of moving, lit by no honest light. The circle hunted them, and closed the smaller tears where they could, and were driven back from the greater ones, and in the doing of it, Ave passed at last into the third degree of her strange calling. She felt it come. It was not a matter of any number. Vaskar had taught her to distrust the counting of such things, and she had none of the old on-screen reckonings anyway, only the deep sense of her own reserves and reach. But there was a threshold, and she crossed it in the worst of the rift fighting, when a horror out of the dark had Bran pinned and dying, and Ave reached deeper into her domain than she ever had, and burned an entire lightless quarter of it to ash to save him, and came out the other side of that burning changed, deepened, her hold on the deep, vast, and terrible in a way it had not been the hour before. Third degree. Enough, Vaskar judged, to stand before the sightless magister and not simply die. Not enough, he did not need to say, to be sure of more than that. They secured the 3 springs in that same season, and it nearly cost them Fen. Listen had spoken of them, the hidden waters that the old alchemists prized above gold, the spring of life whose water quickened, the spring of souls whose water touched the part of a person that is not the body, the spring of radiance whose water burned corruption as the sun burns mist. They lay in a deep and guarded place, and the circle fought their way to them through rift spawn and worse, and drew off what they could carry in stoppered vials, and Listen stored the waters away with a care that Ave did not fully understand and did not question. "For the end," was all the Dryad would say. "Trust me, child. There is a price coming that only these can pay. Better we have them and never need them than need them and weep." And Bran earned his mark. It happened in the rifts where marks are earned, those earned by names that are not mere reputation, but carry a real and metaphysical weight, that change what a person is by changing what the world calls them. Bran took a wound from a corrupting thing of the dark, a foulness that should have rotted him from the inside, as it rotted everything it touched, and he did not rot. His great bare-blooded body, his Farron constitution. Something in the deep, clean strength of him simply refused the corruption, threw it off, healed clean where any other would have festered and died. Leeson watched it, and her ancient eyes narrowed, and afterward she made him submit to a long examination, and at the end of it she said, slowly, "The incorruptible. That is what you are, boy. It has settled on you. Filth cannot hold in you. You throw off what would poison another." She did not say the rest of what she was thinking then, but she remembered it, and she thought of the price that was coming, and of a corruption there would be no throwing off by ordinary means, and she was quiet for a long time. For it was in this season that Ave came at last to understand the thing that would win the war, and it came out of Vascar's teaching and Leeson's both, laid side by side until the shape between them stood clear. Vascar had taught her that a hollow is bound to its deep, and that the binding runs both ways, that anima flows between the hollow and its domain along that bond, and that what flows one way can be made to flow the other. Leeson had taught her the old necromancy of stolen souls, that a soul traded to the powers cannot die as men die, but must be anchored to the world by a relic, a vessel. A reliquary, the old word was, an unholy mockery of a saint's bones, into which the necromancer pours some part of himself, so that while the reliquary endures, the soul cannot pass on. Break the man, and he reforms from the reliquary. Break the reliquary, and... But here Leeson grew careful. Break the reliquary alone, and you might not be enough if the soul had found some second anchor. Ave sat with the two teachings a long while, in the dark of her deep, turning them over. And then, on a cold night near the end of the season, she went very still, and Piper's letters flickered, and she understood. "He's bound to both," she said aloud to no one, to the dark. That's why the refugees speak of him the way they speak of the world ending. That's why his power is a thing of legend. He didn't only anchor himself to a reliquary, he anchored himself to a hollow. She saw it whole, now, the terrible economy of it. A necromancer bound to a wakeful deep draws on the deep the way I draw on mine. Limitless, near enough, a whole domain's worth of anima flowing to him along the bond. That's how he tore the rifts. That's how he's held Mordvale 3 ages. His power isn't his own strength, it's a deep's, poured into him without end. And then, softer, the last piece, which means it can be reversed. A bond that runs both ways. If I could bind myself as he is bound, and turn his own siphon back on him, pour a deep's anima into him instead of letting him draw it out. She stopped, because the thought went to a dark place, and she was not ready yet to look at how dark. She told Leeson only that she thought she understood how the Magister might be beaten. She did not tell the Dryad, or Vascar, or any of them, the full price the beating would ask, because she had begun to guess it, and she did not want to be argued out of it before the hour came when it would be needed. So the circle stood ready as a season of blood and teaching could make them. Ave at the 3rd degree, with a terrible insight locked behind her teeth. Bran bearing the incorruptible mark. Kestra and Fen honed to the edge of their arts. The mentors gathered. The 3 springs stoppered and waiting. Piper grown warm and bright and strong. They had done all that could be done in the doing. What remained could only be answered in the war itself. And the sightless Magister, in his tower in the east, felt the small, bright, benevolent hollow of Halmar's keep pass into the 3rd degree. Felt, perhaps, the gold anima he had hungered for 3 ages, growing at last great enough to be worth the taking, and he stopped waiting. The undead host came out of the east under a sky the color of a bruise, and the barrows opened before it as it passed, and the dead of 3 ages of barrow wars rose and fell into its ranks, and it came down upon the frontier like a gray tide with the wrongness of the outer dark howling in its van. It came for Halmar's keep, over the buried grave of Oralanth, toward the small gray hollow at the mountain's root. And on the day the watch on the wall first saw the dust of its coming stain the eastern horizon, 2 blows were already being readied to answer it, one at the wall and one, far off, aimed at the black heart of Mordvale itself. The war had come. It had taken 3,000 years to arrive, and it would be decided in a handful of days. Kestra stood on the wall of Halmar's keep in the bruised dawn and watched the end of the world come east to west across the frontier, and thought that it looked, from a distance, almost like weather. It was not weather. As it neared, the gray tide resolved into what it was, rank upon rank of the risen dead, barrow lords in corroded mail, and the nameless slain behind them in their thousands, and among them the wrongness that did not belong to any honest death, the rift things, the dark spawn, capering and wrong-shaped and lit by no light, driven forward as a shepherd drives a flock, toward the town and the wall and the small defiant handful who meant to hold them. The plan was set, and Kestra hated every part of it, and knew there was no better one. The host could not be beaten in the field. The town could only hope to hold its wall while the true blow was struck elsewhere. For the Magister could not truly die while his reliquary endured and his hollow bond fed him. And so, even as his army marched on Halmar's keep, a raid team was to ride hard for the east, for Mordvale and the crypt of the founders, to break his outer defenses and seize the reliquary that anchored his soul. Fen and Bran would go with them, and Vaskar to bear them swiftly and fight at their side, and the strongest of the uplifted and the guild. And Ave and Kestra would stay. Ave because her deep was here, and her power rooted in it, and the Magister's own attention, they all knew, would fall upon her domain the moment the battle was joined. Kestra because she would not leave Ave, and because when the sightless Magister came for the little hollow at the mountain's root, Ave would need one person at her side who could put a soul down with a touch. So the 4 who had come up out of the deep together as one company were to be split in half on the worst morning of their lives, and there was no time even to grieve it properly. "Come back," Kestra told Fen and Bran on the wall, gripping each of them hard by the arm. "Both of you, do you hear? You go, you take the thing, you come back. That's the whole of the order. Anyone who doesn't come back answers to me." "To you," Bran agreed, and tried for his old grin, and did not quite find it, and pulled her into a rough embrace instead, and then Fen, and then he was gone down the wall stair toward the waiting dragon and the eastern road, and Fen a shadow at his heels, and Kestra turned back to the oncoming dark with her eyes stinging and her hands steady. Verona Holt held the wall. She stood at its center in plain guild mail with the whole ragged defense of Halmar's keep arrayed under her broad, steady hand. The guild in its ranks, the town watch that Crane's coin owned and that fought anyway because the alternative was worse. The uplifted poor who had been nothing a season ago and stood now as delvers because a small gray hollow had opened a door in them. And beside Verona, in shining consecrated plate, stood Sir Gallen. He was a holy warrior of the Church of the Radiant Dawn, and by every teaching of his order, the thing beneath the town should have been an abomination he was oath-bound to burn. But Sir Gallen had come to the frontier chasing the failing rifts and the stirring dead, and he had seen with his own eyes what the deep beneath Halmar's keep did. The books, the granted callings, the lifted poor, the town made whole, and he had made a quiet private peace with a truth his order would have called heresy, that here, against all doctrine, was a wakeful deep that healed. He did not speak of it. He simply took his place on the wall to defend the town the hollow had saved, and his consecrated blade shone with the clean gold light of the dawn, and where it shone, the wrongness of the outer dark recoiled. The host broke upon the wall like a gray sea upon a stone. Kestra had been in fights her whole life and had never imagined anything like it. The dead came on without fear because they had nothing left to fear with, climbing their own fallen to reach the parapet, and the rift things came behind them, and the defenders held by Verona's iron command, and Galen's shining blade, and the sheer refusal of a cornered people to die quietly. Kestra fought where the press was worst, the 9 turnings open in her now with no reason left to hide it, laying barrow lords down with soul strikes that guttered the gray light in their eyes. And beside her, the uplifted poor of Halmar's keep, Havoc and Sarn and Devon and the rest, fought for the hollow who had made them and did not break. And below, beneath the wall, beneath the town, in the buried grove at the mountain's root, the sightless magister's attention came down upon Ave's domain like a great cold hand. She felt him before she saw anything of him, felt his awareness press into her deep from the east, vast and patient and eyeless, testing the edges of her hollow the way a man tests a door he means to break. He did not come in body, he did not need to. His power reached across the leagues along whatever dark road connected his failing rifts to the wounded world, and it fell upon Ave's domain and began, methodically, to unmake it. To crush her brood, to blacken her moss, to press upon the very shape of her deep with a weight that made Ave, at its heart, cry out and stagger. This was the true assault. The army above was the hammer. This was the hand that meant to seize the thing the hammer broke open. And Ave, holding her domain against him with everything she had, understood with a lurch of pure dread exactly what Fenn's refugees had meant, and what her own insight had told her, and what she had not truly believed until she felt it, that his power had no bottom. She spent, and he pressed, and she spent more, and still he pressed, unwearying, unending, a whole deep's anima flowing to him without limit, while her own reserves, vast as they were, began to burn down toward their floor. She could not outlast him. She had known it in theory in the quiet of the deep. She knew it now in her bones, with the gray hand closing on her domain and her strength pouring out and no end to his. No one could outlast him. That was the whole horror of what he had made himself. And somewhere far to the east, her friends were racing to take the reliquary that would not, alone, be enough. Above, on the breached and burning wall, the true cost of the morning was about to be paid. A siege horror out of the deepest rift reached the wall at last, a thing the size of a house, wrong beyond the wrongness of the rest, that shrugged off the defender's blows and put its terrible weight against the stone, and the wall cracked and buckled, and a whole span of it came down in ruin, and through the breach the gray tide surged howling toward the heart of the town. Sir Galen met it in the breach alone. There was no decision to it that Kestra saw, no speech, no moment of choice made visible. There was only the wall coming down, and the dark pouring through, and the holy warrior stepping into the gap with his shining blade lifted. One man in the ruin against a tide, because someone had to, and he was nearest, and he had already, long ago, made his peace with what defending this town might cost. The gold light of the dawn blazed out of him, brighter than Kestra had ever seen it, filling the breach wall to wall, and the wrongness recoiled from it, and the dead burned in it, and for long and impossible moments one consecrated knight held the whole broken span of the wall by the sheer, shining refusal of his faith. It could not last, and he did not mean it to. He meant only to hold long enough. He held while the defenders behind him dragged rubble into the gap and reformed their line. He held while Verona bellowed the reserve into place. He held past the point where any man could hold. The gold light pouring out of him and the dark closing in from every side, until at the last the tide simply overwhelmed the light by weight of numbers, and Sir Gawain went down in the breach he had filled, and the gold blazed once more, blindingly, as he spent the whole of himself in a final consecration that scoured the gap clean, and then was gone, night and light together, and where he had stood there was only clean burned stone, and a line of defenders who had been given, at the cost of his life, the moments they needed to hold. They held. The breach was sealed with rubble and bodies and Verona's iron will, and the line closed over the place where Sir Gawain had died, and the wall, against all likelihood, held. Kestra had no time to grieve him. She felt, through the strange low warmth that had lived beneath her ribs since the day the gold moat touched her, the warmth she had never fully understood, the thread that tied her, though she did not yet know how deeply, to the little hollow below. She felt Ave falter, felt the gray hand closing, and she turned from the held wall and the fallen knight and ran for the stair that led down into the deep, toward the small gray friend who was, alone in the dark against a bottomless enemy, beginning to lose. 2 blows fell now toward the same dark heart, Fen and Bran in the east, racing the reliquary home, and Kestra plunging down through the mountain toward the duel in the deep, where Ave stood spending her life against a magister who could not be outlasted, and where the war would, in the end, be decided. Far to the east, at the same hour, Fen crouched in the shadow of a broken arch and looked out across the courtyard of Mordvale at the crypt of the founders, and made himself breathe the way Kestra had taught him, and did not let his hands shake. They had ridden the old worm through a night and a day, Vaskar's great dark bulk carrying the raid team over the war-torn miles faster than any road, and they had come down out of a bruised sky onto the necromancer's fastness as the assault on Halmar's keep began, so that the 2 blows fell together as the plan required. Mordvale was worse than the tales. It was an old place, older than the Sundering, a black tower and its bailey raised over a crypt that went down into the earth like a wound, and the air of it was the air of the outer dark leaking through. Cold that was not weather, a gray seep of wrong light, the sense of being watched by something with no eyes. The rifts were near here. Finn could feel them. The great ancient tears the Magister had torn 3 ages gone, failing now, spilling their horrors. And this was the place they were anchored, and this was where the thing that anchored the Magister's soul was kept. The outer defenses fell to the raid team's fury and Vaskar's fire, but the crypt of the founders was not defended by mere undead, and when the raiders broke into its great low hall, they found what the Magister had kept there 3 ages to guard his soul, and Finn's heart nearly failed him at the sight. 3 figures rose from 3 great biers to meet them, and they were legends, and they were dead, and the Magister had made them his. The first was a warrior lord in scorched and ancient plate, and where his hands had been, there was a blade of unquenchable fire. Sir Aldous, the flame-sworn, whose burning sword had cut the first roads through the deeps when the world was young, raised now to a mockery of himself, the honest fire of him turned to a dead, gray flame. The second was a broad and terrible smith-lord of the Dolm Deepfolk, Borin Deephand, whose great hammer had forged the gates of Oralanth, swinging now for the raiders' skulls. And the third? The third was an old Orin archmage, robed in the tatters of a magister's scholarly finery, and lightning that had gone the color of a corpse fire crawled along his withered hands, and Fen heard Bran make a low, broken sound beside him, because this was Thaldwin. Thaldwin the Stormwise, who had built the Athenaeum with his own hands and his own art, who had raised the greatest library the world had known, and who, 3 ages ago in a wealthy, magical city, had once lifted a small, anxious grove child to see a book behind glass and told her she had good eyes for a larkin. Ave had spoken of him. He was the last kind memory of her lost childhood, the old master who had encouraged her when she was small and frightened. And here he stood, raised and enslaved, and turned against the very light he had built, his ancient face slack and eyeless empty in the necromancer's gray service. He kept them here to guard him, Fen breathed. The 3 who made the city. He killed them the night he broke the world, and he raised them, and he set them to guard the very soul that murdered them. The horror of it and the grief nearly unmanned him. Ave's Thaldwin. Bran, that's Thaldwin, the one who was kind to her.
Then we set him free, Bran said, and his voice was thick, and he took the shape of the bear because it was the only mercy he had to give. All 3 of them. They shouldn't be here. They shouldn't be this. We put them to rest. That's the kindest thing we can do for them, and the worst thing we can do to him. Come on. It was the hardest fighting any of them had ever done, and the most terrible, because it was a battle against heroes. The Founder Lords fought with the strength of their legends, and the raid team fell back, and rallied, and fell back again. Vaskar's fire met Sir Aldis's dead gray flame, and the crypt shook. Bran, in his bear shape, closed with Borin Deephand, and took blows from the forge hammer that would have killed anything with less of the deep, clean strength in it. And Fen. Fen, who had grown from a silent outcast scout into something the guild now ranked near the top of its rolls, who read the deep better than any living soul. Fen faced the raised archmage Thaldwin and used everything he had learned, and found the openings his keen half-Orin senses gave him, and struck true. They laid the founders to rest one by one, and it was not a victory that anyone cheered. As each fell, as the dead gray flame went out of Sir Aldis at last and left only a weary old warrior's shape sinking gratefully into stillness, as Borin Deephand's hammer stilled and the Smith Lord bowed his broken head as though a long labor were finally done, as the corpse lightning guttered from Thaldwin's hands, and the ancient archmage looked up, in the final instant, with something almost like recognition, almost like relief, before he crumbled, the raiders felt not triumph, but a vast and sorrowful mercy, the mercy of releasing captives who had been held in torment 3 ages by the thing they had died to build against. Rest, Bran said hoarsely, human-shaped again, kneeling by the last of the fallen founders. You did your part. You built her a place worth remembering. She's rebuilding it, you know. Avenue, the little Larkin. She's raising your library back up out of the dust. You'd be proud. Rest now. And at the heart of the emptied crypt, on a black altar where the 3 biers had stood guard, they found the reliquary. It was a small and dreadful thing, an unholy inversion of a saint's reliquary, a vessel of black bone and tarnished silver, cold as the outer dark, and it hummed with a wrong gray light. And when Fen came near it, his every instinct screamed that here was the anchor. Here was the thing that kept the Magister's stolen soul chained to the world. Lysen's teaching was in his mind. While the reliquary endures, the soul cannot pass.
Break the man, and he reforms from this. This was what they had come for. This was the outer anchor of the sightless magister's deathlessness. But Fenn's keen sense, closing on the thing, told him something else besides, something that turned his relief cold. The reliquary held the magister's soul, yes, but it was not the whole of his anchoring. There was another bond running out of it, out of the crypt, away to the west. A great flow of anima along a dark channel, the siphon that fed him from his hollow, the second anchor Lysen had grown careful speaking of. Taking the reliquary broke his power to reform. It did not, by itself, break the thing that made him unbeatable in the first place. That would have to be broken at the other end. That would have to be broken by Avenue. "We have it," Fenn said, and lifted the cold, dreadful vessel with hands wrapped in cloth, and felt the weight of the whole war settle onto it. "We have his soul anchor, but it's not enough on its own. I can feel it. His powers still flowing, still feeding from his deep off to the west, toward home, toward Av." He looked at Bran and at Vaskar's great patient eye, and the fear in him was very clear and very cold. "We have to get this to her, now, however fast the worm can fly, because whatever she's doing back there against him, she's the one who has to close the other end, and she's doing it alone." They took the reliquary, and they fled the emptied crypt, up out of the wound of Mordvale and on to the old worm's back. And Vaskar flung himself westward into the bruised sky faster than he had flown in an age, racing the ruin of the world home to Halmar's keep, where Ave, at the mountain's root, was already spending the last of her life against an enemy who could not be outlasted, and where Kestra, plunging down through the dark, was almost at her side. Ave was on her knees in the ruined grove at the mountain's root when Kestra found her, and she was losing. The buried clearing where her mother had died 3 ages gone was the heart of her deep now, the deepest and truest place of her domain, and it was here that the sightless magister's assault fell heaviest, because he was no fool and he struck at the root. His awareness filled the dark, vast and gray and eyeless, and it pressed upon Ave's hollow with a weight past bearing, crushing her brood, blackening her light, unmaking the domain she had built out of grief and love. And Ave held it with everything 3 ages and a mother's gift had made her, and it was not enough, because there was no bottom to what he spent. She poured out her gold anima against him, and he drank a whole deep's worth in answer, and she was burning down toward her floor, gray-faced and shaking and alone in the dark that had once held her mother's body, and she could not outlast him, and she had always known she could not outlast him, and now the hour had come to do the thing she had not let herself look at. "Ave!" Kestra dropped to her knees beside her, and Ave turned a face on her that was already half a corpse's, spent and gray and lit only by the fierce gold guttering low in her eyes. "He's bound to both," Ave whispered. There was no time for more. She had perhaps moments before her reserves gave out, and the gray hand closed and took her, and her mother's gold with her. Reliquary and hollow. Fenn was right. I can feel his siphon, feel it drawing, a hole deep, pouring into him without end. That's why no one can beat him. He's not spending his strength, he's spending a deep's. Her hand found Kestra's and gripped it with the last of her failing power. "The bond runs both ways, Kes. Vaskar taught me. What flows out can flow back in. If I bind myself the way he's bound, bind myself to my own hollow, all the way, no holding back, I can turn his siphon around. Pour a deep's anima into him instead of letting him draw it out. Burn him with his own bottomless well. She swallowed. But I can't reach deep enough. Not far enough. Not with what's left in me. I need more. A whole deep's worth, all at once, poured through me in one stroke. And I don't have the reach. Syl came then, as if summoned by the need, the little silver-blue ooze, Ave's childlike companion, that had followed the raid team's warnings and Ave's own fear down through the deep to find its mother. And Ave looked at it, at the one strange gift Vaskar had told her to remember, and understood the last piece. An ooze could slip. An ooze of a wakeful deep could pour itself between one place and another, thinning out of the world here and reforming there, as though the spaces of the deep were less firmly separate for it than for anyone else. Syl could open a way. Syl could link her domain to another, to Vaskar's vast ancient deep in the mountain's root, to more deep than Ave alone could ever hold, and pour it through. Syl, Ave said, and her voice broke on it, because she knew what she was asking, and she knew the thing might not come back. Syl, my dear one, I need you to slip. I need you to open a way to Vaskar's deep and hold it while I pour it all through me. It will hurt. It might... She could not say it. You don't have to. I would never make you. Syl did not wait to be made. It flowed forward and wrapped itself joyfully about her, and Ave felt it reach, felt the little ooze thin itself against the spaces of the deep and find the great sleeping reservoir of Vaskar's ancient domain, and open, at terrible cost to itself, a way between. The two deeps linked, and through the link, all at once, more anima than Ave's small, wasted body was ever meant to channel, came roaring toward her. A whole vast deep's worth flooding into her domain and into her. It was not enough only to hold it. She had to bind herself as the Magister was bound, all the way, no holding back, and there was a working for that, a forbidden and terrible working, and Ave had learned it from Lissen's darkest teaching and prayed she would never use it. A Scourge Lord blood rune, the mark of the Devourer's own servants, that binds flesh to power and power to flesh with a demon god's own corrupting anima, so that no part of the caster is held back from the pouring, so that body and deep become one channel with nothing left over to protect the self. It would bind her wholly to her hollow. It would let her turn the siphon, and it would fill her, permanently and past any ordinary curing, with the corruption of the outer dark itself. Ave took up a shard of broken stone, and she cut the rune into the flesh of her own arm, letter by burning letter in her own blood. And as the last stroke closed, the corruption went into her like fire into dry grass. And she screamed, and the binding took hold, and she was one with her deep at last, wholly, nothing held back, the flood of two linked domains pouring through the single channel of her small, dying body. And she reversed the siphon. She reached along the dark bond that fed the sightless Magister, the great channel of anima he had drawn on without end for 3 ages, and instead of letting him draw, she poured. She poured a whole deep's worth of anima back up the siphon, and then Vaskar's deep behind it, and then the burning of her own domain, all of it at once, up the channel and into the necromancer at the far end, faster than he could shed it, more than any vessel could hold. Across the leagues, in the same instant, the raid team crested the mountain on Vaskar's back, and Fen felt the siphon reverse, felt the Magister's bottomless well turn against him, the thing that had made him unbeatable becoming, in a single stroke, the exact mechanism of his ruin. For this was the whole irony of him, revealed at last and entire. The sightless Magister had earned his false warden's mark, had claimed for 3 ages the title of one who guards the world's wall against the outer dark, by guarding the world from the very horrors he himself had loosed. And his greatest strength, the limitless siphon that made him a god, was the one door through which he could be destroyed. Ave burned him with his own bottomless well. She poured an entire deep's anima into a soul that had made itself the drain for one, and the drain could not close. And the anima went into him and burned. The cost was her life, and she paid it without flinching, and she felt herself going. The rune blazed on her arm. The corruption raged through her. The flood tore through her small body faster than flesh could bear, and she poured it all out and kept nothing back. And she collapsed at the last, spent past the floor of herself, her gold anima gone, her life pouring after it, sinking down into the dark of the ruined grove where her mother had died, dying now herself in the same place 3 ages on. And she thought, with the last clear thought she had, that at least it had worked. At least he was burning. At least. The Magister did not die of it, quite. He was too old and too terrible and too deeply bound. And even burning, he reached back one last time to take the gold he had come for, to seize the small dying hollow before her fire could finish him, to enfeeble and drain her the way he had drained everything for 3 ages. And Ave, spent, could not stop him. Her defense was gone. Her life was going. The gray hand closed. And Kestra rose up between them, barely alive herself, and finished it. She had been enfeebled by his backlash, drained near to nothing by the wave of his dying malice, and she came up off the ground anyway, because the small gray friend who had reached through the world to keep her alive was dying at her feet, and she would not allow it. The 9 turnings opened in her, all of them, the whole soul and breath discipline of her murdered people, and the low warmth beneath her ribs that was a shard of Ave's own mother's gold, blazed up to meet the need. And Kestra struck. Not once. The 9 turnings, all 9, laid one after another into the burning ruin of the sightless Magister. The breath thief, the soul drain, the strikes that reached past flesh into the part of a thing that is not the body, and unmade it. She drained him as he had drained others, turned his own art of stealing back upon him, struck at his stolen soul itself 9 times, driving the burning wreck of him down and down toward an end. And at the 9th and final turning, at the crucial instant, when the Magister's soul was driven to the very edge and one last conduit still held it anchored to the world, Piper's mote reached him. The little gold-bound book had been at Ave's breast throughout, her mother's residual anima, her last link to Seraphine Larkin, and as Ave fell dying, it did the last thing it was ever meant to do. A single bright mote of gold rose from its pages, the same gold that had touched Kestra in the alley 3 ages of an afternoon ago, the same gold Seraphine had poured out to save her daughter at this very namestone, and it drifted, unhurried, through the burning dark, and it settled on the last dark conduit that bound the Magister's soul to the world, and it severed it. Clean. Final. The mother's gold, cutting at the very end the last thread of the thing that had murdered her. The body of the sightless Magister fell. It fell in the ruined grove where he had killed Seraphine Larkin 3 ages gone, and it did not rise, and it did not reform, and his stolen soul, burned by his own siphon, driven to the edge by the 9 turnings, severed at the last by a dead woman's love, was caught, cut loose from the world's anchor, drawn helplessly into the one vessel still able to hold it, the reliquary, arriving in Fenn's cloth-wrapped hands as Vaskar swept down into the deep, the black-bone vessel dragging the burning soul into itself and sealing it there, trapped, undestroyed, but no longer able to walk the world. It was done. The sightless Magister was brought down. His body fell, and his soul was caught, and the war above broke as its dark heart failed, the leaderless host beginning, even then, to falter and rot where it stood. But Ave lay unmoving in the dark of the ruined grove, the Scourge Lord rune burning black on her arm, the corruption of the outer dark raging through the small, spent ruin of her body, her gold anima gone and her life going after it, dying now of the very stroke that had won the war, in the same clearing where her mother had died to give her 3 ages of borrowed time. Kestra caught her as she fell, and screamed for the others, and Syl, pale and shrunken, and barely returned from the slipping that had nearly ended it, flowed weakly to Ave's side, and Vaskar came down into the deep with Fenn and Bran leaping from his back, and the whole circle closed at last around the small gray hollow who had saved them all, and was dying in their arms for the doing of it. They bore her down into Vaskar's deep, into the vast, warm, ancient dark at the mountain's root, that was the old worm's own domain. Because it was the safest place in the world, and because Vaskar's healing was the greatest any of them could command. And it was not enough, and they all knew within the first hour that it was not enough. Vaskar coiled his immense bulk around the small broken shape of her and poured his ancient anima into her, and it held death off, held it at the very threshold, kept the last spark of her from going out, but it could not touch the thing that was killing her. The Scourge Lord rune had done what such runes do. The corruption of the outer dark was in her now, in her blood and her marrow and the very substance of her soul. A demon god's own foulness that no honest healing could burn and no clean power could cast out. Vaskar could keep her from dying this hour. He could not keep her from dying. Left as she would burn from the inside until nothing remained, and all his ancient art could do was slow it. "There is no cure," he rumbled, and the grief in that vast voice was a terrible thing to hear. "Not for this. What she took into herself is not a wound to be closed. It is a poison with no bottom, as his siphon had no bottom. I can hold her at the edge. I cannot bring her back from it." Kestra would not accept it, and neither would Bran, and neither, though she said less, would the ancient dryad who had come down through the deep the moment she felt what her ward had done. Lisa knelt by Ave's side and looked at the black rune on the small gray arm and the corruption raging under the skin, and her ancient face, which had seen ages come and go, was wet. "Oh, child," she murmured, "you forbidden, foolish, wholehearted thing, you did the very working I prayed you would never touch." And then she was still a long moment, thinking, ages of alchemy turning behind her deep water eyes. And when she rose, she was no longer weeping. "There is a thing that might be done. Not a cure. Hear me, there is no cure. She will bear this to the end of her days. But a thing that might let her live to bear it. The 3 springs. I did not gather them for nothing. I told you a price was coming that only they could pay. And here it is." She brewed the elixir there in Vaskar's deep over long and desperate hours, while Ave burned and the others held their breaths. The waters of the 3 springs were the base of it, the spring of life to quicken, the spring of souls to reach the part of her the corruption had touched, the spring of radiance to burn the foulness as the sun burns mist. But the waters alone were not enough. The corruption was too deep, too bound into her by the rune, and the elixir needed more than water to reach it. It needed essence, living essence, freely given from those strong enough in the right ways to answer what the poison was. Bran gave first, and gladly. A drop of his blood, his Farron blood, his bear-clean blood, marked now with the incorruptible, the very thing that threw off corruption where it touched. "Take it," he said, before Leeson had finished asking. "Take whatever she needs. I throw off filth. That's what I'm for. If any part of me can go into her and help her carry this, then that's the best use I'll ever be put to." Vaskar gave next, a drop of the old worm's ancient, near-divine essence, the deep, clean strength of a thing older than the sundering. And Leeson gave last, of her own immensely old green life, the Green Mother's own essence, freely and without hesitation for the child of her kinsman Alder, whom she had sworn to protect. 3 drops, 3 freely given essences, into the waters of the 3 springs. And Leeson brewed them into the elixir, and they poured it, drop by careful drop, between Ave's gray lips. And Ave, at the very threshold of death, drew it in and did not die. The elixir could not cure her. Nothing could cure her. The corruption was permanent, bound into her by the forbidden rune, a thing she would carry all her life. But it reached the foulness where no honest healing could, and it burned back the worst of it, and it stabilized the small, guttering spark of her that Vaskar had held at the edge, and slowly, over hours, over a day, over 2, it drew her back from dying into merely being terribly, dangerously ill. Her gray face found a little color. Her breath steadied. The rune on her arm did not fade. It would never fade. But the corruption ceased its raging and settled into something that could, with care, be born. She woke on the 2nd day, and the first thing she saw was Kestra's face bent over her, hollow-eyed with sleeplessness. And the first thing she felt was the black weight of the corruption sitting permanent in her blood. And the first thing she said, in a thread of a voice, was, "I'm sorry. I made you all," and could not finish, because she saw what it had cost them, saw Syl shrunken and pale, saw Bran gray with giving, saw the exhaustion in every face, and her guilt was a terrible thing. "Don't," Kestra said fiercely, and took her hand, and would not let her look away. "Don't you dare be sorry. You saved the world. You burned him with his own well, and Kes put him down, and your mother's moat cut him loose, and it worked, Ave. It worked. He's caught. He can't walk the world. You did that. And if the price is that we carry a little of it with you, then we carry it. That's what we're for. That's what we chose, in the dark, the day Fen told us what you were. We keep you. We keep you good, and we keep you alive. And if it cost us something, then that's ours to spend." Her voice cracked. "You don't get to die on us to save us the trouble of loving you. That's not how it works." And Leeson, gruff and immense at the bedside, laid out the shape of the rest of Ave's life, plainly, so that there would be no false hope and no despair either. "The corruption is permanent," she said. "You will carry it to the end of your days. But you need not carry it alone, and you need not carry all of it at once. Bran bears the incorruptible. Filth cannot hold in him. He can take your corruption onto himself, periodically as it wells up, and throw it off and give you respite. And Kestra," the Dryad looked at the hard-faced Vale girl who had loved this child since a gold moat touched her in an alley. Kestra's 9 turnings reach the soul, the part of you the corruption most deeply stains. She can heal there, where no other can, and mend what the poison wears down. Between the two of them, and the elixir when it is needed, you can live. Not cured, never cured, but whole enough, born between the 3 of you. She almost smiled. It is not the ending you would have wished, but it is a life. And it is a life your friends have chosen, with open eyes, to help you live. That is worth more, I think, than a cure that cost nobody anything. So the price of victory was settled into something that could be born, the elixir that had saved her, Bran's periodic bearing of her corruption, Kestra's soul healing, an ongoing sacrifice made not once but as a permanent gift of the found family to the small hollow at its heart. Ave lived. Ave would go on living, carrying the mark of the devourer in her blood and the love of her friends over it. And slowly, over the days that followed, she grew strong enough to sit, and then to stand, and then to think clearly again. And when she could think clearly, she thought of the reliquary, of the black bone vessel sitting sealed and terrible in Vaskar's deep, holding the burned and trapped soul of the sightless magister, undestroyed. For she had won the war, and paid its price, and lived. But Corvain L. was not yet dead. He was caught, held, unable to walk the world. But a soul in a reliquary is a soul that endures, and while it endured, some part of the horror was only sleeping. She knew what had to be done. And she knew, with a slow, cold certainty, that she was the only person alive who could do it. "There's one thing left," she said, on the day she could finally stand unaided, and the circle gathered round her in Vaskar's warm, ancient dark to hear it. "He's caught, but he's not gone. A soul in a reliquary doesn't pass on. That's the whole point of the thing. As long as that vessel holds him, he's only sleeping. He could be freed. Some fool in some age could break it and loose him again." She looked at their faces, and then down at Piper, warm and steady in her hands, her mother's gold, and she understood at last the full circle of the thing. "There's only one working I know that can lift a soul out of what anchors it and seal it away where it can finally, truly die. And I'm the only one left who can cast it, because I lived inside it for 3 ages. I felt it break and repair around me. I know its shape from the inside the way no one living does." Her voice went soft and steady and sure. "My mother's spell, the Stillstand, the same working that saved me is the one that ends him. I'm going to use it to lift his soul out of the reliquary and seal it, and hold the seal until it fails and he dies for good. It's the last thing she left me the means to do, and it's exactly right that it should be hers that finishes him." They carried the reliquary up out of Vaskar's deep and into the ruined grove at the mountain's root, to the broken namestone where it had all begun, because Ave said the working ought to be cast in the place her mother had first cast it, and no one argued. The whole circle came. Kestra and Fen and Bran, Listen and Gorm, Vaskar filling the dark behind them. Ren and Verona come down from the town. Syl recovered enough to flow at Ave's feet, and they gathered in the deep clearing where Seraphine Larkin had died 3 ages gone, and they set the black bone vessel on the broken stump of the namestone, and Ave stood before it with Piper open in her hands. She was still ill. The corruption sat black in her blood, held back by the elixir and Bran's bearing and Kestra's healing, and she would carry it all her life. But her mind was clear, and her purpose was steady. And when she opened her mother's residual anima and reached for the shape of the Stillstand, she found it waiting for her, held in Piper's pages the way her mother had held it in her own gold 3 ages ago. She knew the working from the inside. That was the thing no other living soul could have said.
She had lived 3,000 years locked within an instant, frozen in time. She had felt its golden skin around her. She had felt it wear and strain, and at last begin to fail. She had, without knowing it, learned its every fold and turning in the long dark of her sleeping. And so when she cast it now, she cast it not as a scholar reconstructing a lost art, but as a woman remembering a place she had lived. The gold rose from Piper and from her own restored anima. Her mother's gold and her own become one, and it gathered over the reliquary in a slow amber light. And Ave reached into the vessel with the working and took hold of the thing inside. She felt him, the burned and trapped soul of the sightless magister, of Corvain L., who had been her mother's colleague, and then her mother's murderer, and then the ruin of her whole world. She felt him in the reliquary, diminished, caught, but enduring still, a small, cold, gray knot of stolen soul that had cheated death 3 ages and cheated it yet. And she could have heard him. That was the thing she understood, standing there with his soul in the grip of her mother's working. She had the power, in that moment, to make him suffer for everything, for her father in the burning grove, for her mother aging a lifetime in a heartbeat, for the Athenaeum gone to dust, and the 10,000 dead, and the 3 ages she had spent frozen in the dark. She could have poured every ounce of her grief into that small, cold knot of him, and made his ending an agony worthy of what he had done. She did not. "No," she said quietly, to the trapped soul, to her friends, to herself. "I won't become you. That's the one thing you don't get to make me. You spent yourself to torment a whole world. You will not spend 1 drop of me on tormenting you." And she lifted his soul out of the reliquary with her mother's gold, gently, the way one lifts a splinter, and she sealed it. Wrapped it in the stillstand as her mother had once wrapped her, an instant frozen and held out of time, a stasis from which there would be no waking. She spent her warrant to do it, the deep metaphysical authority a warden wields to bind and seal, and she bound the seal fast, and she set it in the deep to hold. Then the circle kept vigil. They kept it in the ruined grove for days, all of them, turn and turn about, watching the sealed soul held in its golden stasis, while the working did its slow and final work. For this was the mercy and the finality of the stillstand turned to such a purpose. A soul that cannot die while it is anchored can, once lifted free of every anchor and sealed away from the world, at last simply cease. Held out of time, cut off from the world's power, severed from reliquary and hollow both, the small, cold knot of Corvain L. had nothing left to endure on, and slowly, over the days of the vigil, they felt him fade, felt the gray knot thin and dim and loosen, and on a gray dawn much like the one on which the war had begun, the seal at last completed its work, and the trapped soul of the sightless magister guttered out like a spent candle, and Corvain L. died. Truly, finally, past all raising and all return, 3 ages after he had murdered the world and been so sure he had made himself a god. There was no drama to it. There was only a small fading in the dark, and then a stillness, and then the certain knowledge, felt by every soul keeping the vigil, that the thing was gone and would not come again. Ave wept a little when she felt him go, not for him, for her mother, whose working had done this, for her father, avenged at last in the same grove where he had fallen, for the long, unbearable weight of 3 ages that lifted, in that stillness, from her small shoulders. Kestra held her, and Bran's great hand rested on her head, and Fen stood close, and the mentors gathered round, and the whole circle stood in the ruined grove and felt the war end, quietly, in the place where it had begun.
Above, in the world, the last of it was already ending too. The undead host that had besieged Halmar's keep, leaderless from the moment its dark heart failed at the climax, had been rotting where it stood ever since. And now, with the Magister truly gone, the last gray animation went out of it entirely, and the risen dead of 3 ages of barrow wars fell down at last into the honest stillness that had been so long denied them. Verona's defenders, exhausted and grieving and victorious, walked out through their broken wall onto a field of settling bones under a clearing sky, and the siege of Halmar's keep was over, and the war was won. But the war's ending was not the world's mending. As Ave stood in the quiet grove with her enemy finally dead and her friends around her and the long weight lifted, she looked east, toward Mordvale and beyond it, and she knew that the hardest of the labor was, in a sense, only now beginning. For the sightless Magister was dead, but his rifts were not closed. The great ancient wounds he had torn in the world's skin 3 ages ago, failing and spilling their horrors across the frontier and, the scattered lore suggested, across worlds beyond this one. Those gaped still, and would go on gaping, and go on bleeding the outer dark into the world, until someone closed them. "He's gone," Av said quietly, to the circle, to the clearing dawn. "It's over. He's really, finally gone." And then, after a moment, looking east, "But his rifts aren't. He tore holes in the world that are still open, still bleeding. That doesn't end because he's dead." She closed Piper gently, and there was grief in her face, and something else besides. The old scholar's steadiness, the quiet resolve of a person looking at a very long task and deciding to begin it. "So there's more to do. There's a great deal more to do. But not today." She let out a breath and leaned into Kestra's shoulder and let herself, for one moment, simply be a small, tired person who had done a very great and terrible thing. Today he's dead, and we're alive, and that's enough. Tomorrow we start closing his rifts, however long it takes. It took years, in the end, and they were good years, which Ave had not expected any years to be again. The closing of the rifts was the work of them, the long, slow labor that filled the seasons after the war, and it was dangerous, and it was endless, and it was, in its way, the truest thing Ave ever did. For the sightless Magister had torn his wounds not only in the skin of this world, but through it, into places beyond, and to close them the circle had to go where they led, out through the veil tears into the strange dark spaces on the far side, and seal them, one by one, from within. Ave's own domain became the tool of it. A hollow, she had learned, is a rooted thing, a fixed place in the world's substance, and where her deep touched a rift, it could grow across the wound like a scar, like a living dam, closing the tear with the patient strength of the deep itself. So they went from rift to rift across the frontier and beyond it, Ave and her friends, and where they went, the wounds of 3 ages closed behind them, and the outer dark stopped bleeding into the world a little more with each one, and slowly the frontier grew quiet, and then the lands beyond, and the long, unhealing hurt the Magister had left began, at last, to heal. And in the doing of it, Ave came into the thing her mother had been. She felt it settle on her the way marks settle, not granted by any hand, but earned by the deed, the world itself recognizing what she had become and naming it. Warden of the Threshold, the mark her mother had borne, the ancient title of those who guard the world's wall against the outer dark. And it came to Ave not by inheritance but by right, because she was doing, now, the very thing the title meant, standing at the threshold between the world and the dark and holding it, closing the wounds, guarding the wall. She wept the first time she felt it settle, because it was her mother's, and because it meant her mother's work was done at last, carried through by the daughter she had died to save. Seraphine Larkin had been warden of the threshold. Now Aveline Larkin was, and the wall her mother had held 3 ages ago against a single terrible night, her daughter held now against all the wounds that night had left. The corruption she carried still. That did not change and would not. She bore the devourer's mark in her blood to the end of her days, but she bore it as Lysanne had said she would, not alone and not all at once. Bran took it from her when it welled up, periodically and gladly, throwing off with his incorruptible strength what would have poisoned her, and stood whole and steadfast between the bearings. Kestra healed the deep soul hurt of it, the part the corruption most stained, with the 9 turnings that reached where no other healing could. And between the 2 of them, and the elixir when it was needed, Ave lived, and was well, and the ongoing sacrifice of it became simply a part of the fabric of the found family, a thing they did for one another without remark, the way one breathes. The others came into their settled lives besides. Kestra went home, for there was a home to go to now. The Kalir reaches slowly resettling as the war's end let the scattered veil return. And Kestra went among them as an honored elder and master teacher of the 9 turnings, reconciled at last with the grief of the parents and the fighting hall the war had taken, passing on the discipline of her murdered people to a new generation so that it would not die with her. She came back often to Av, the low warmth beneath her ribs, the shard of Seraphine's gold that had touched her in an alley and tied her to the little hollow ever after, never faded. And neither did the friendship it had begun. Fen became the greatest scout the guild had ever ranked, star medal marked, at peace at last with the half-Orin blood that had made him an outcast, and had made him, in the end, the one who read the deep and knew Av's nature and chose to love her anyway. Bran remained what he had always been, the great, steadfast heart of them, whole between his bearings, Lysanne's fond ward, and Av's willing shield to the end. And the mentors stayed close, Lysanne in her devoted Gorm, Vaskar in his ancient deep, Ren keeping the growing library. Syl recovered and cherished, and never again asked to slip at such a cost. For the Athenaeum lived again. That was the quiet triumph that ran beneath all the rest. Av went on raising it from the dust of Oralanth, book by book, and shelf by shelf, and stack by stack. And Ren catalogued and copied, and sent the recovered words out into a world that had gone 3 ages without them. And the buried scholar city that Corvain El had murdered in a single night rose slowly back into being beneath the mountain, restored, rekindled, its green lamps lit once more, its shelves refilled with the words Av drew up out of the deep's long memory. Hallmar's keep flourished above it, and knew now what lived below, and was proud of it. And the poor and the scorned came still to Ave's namestone to be granted good callings, for she never stopped doing that, never stopped seeking out the ones the world called worthless, and opening the door in them that no one else would open, because she remembered, always, what it was to be reckoned nothing, and she had made it the whole purpose of her strange, long life to prove the reckoning wrong. And Piper became what she was always, at the last, going to become. Ave's mother's residual gold anima, made a living book to keep a frozen child from waking alone, had grown all these years alongside her, warm and steady and bright. And as the Athenaeum rose and the rifts closed, and Ave came into the warden's mark, Piper came at last into her own final shape. She evolved, grew, became more than a book, became the living heart of the restored library, and then more than that, the Athenaeum that spans realms, a great gold working that opened doors between Ave's library and the libraries of the worlds beyond. the ones the rift closing had carried them into, and others besides, so that the words of many worlds might flow together at last through the gift a dying mother had left her daughter. Seraphine had poured out her whole self to save one small, frail child, and that self, 3 ages on, had become a bridge between the knowledge of worlds, the greatest library the deep had ever held, spanning realms, which was, Ave thought, exactly what her mother, who had loved words above everything but her family, would have wished to become. And so, on a soft spring evening, years after the war, Aveline Larkin walked out into the blooming grove above her restored city, small and gray and winged as she had always been, the devourer's mark borne quiet in her blood, and her friend's love borne quiet over it. Warden of the threshold, and keeper of the deep that remembered. And she went to the namestone to grant a calling to a scale-born foundling the town had cast out. One more of the worlds discarded, lifted, as she had lifted so many, as she would go on lifting them for the rest of her long, strange life. Leeson walked with her through the flowering trees, ancient and immense and fond, and the two of them paused a moment in the green quiet where Alder had fallen and Seraphine had died, the deep clearing that had been the end of one world and the beginning of another. "They would be proud of you," the Dryad said quietly, watching her kinsman's daughter in the blooming grove. "Alder and Seraphine both. I knew them, child, better than you ever had the years to. I know what they hoped you would be. And you are more than either of them dared hope. You bore what could not be borne, and you did not let it make you cruel. And you spent your whole long life lifting the low and keeping the light and closing the wounds a monster left in the world. Your father held a grove so you could live. Your mother spent herself so you could wake. And look what you did with the waking." Her deep-water eyes were wet and kind. "They would be so proud. I am certain of it. I am as certain of it as I am of anything in all my long years." Ave stood in the grove where she had lost everything, and looked at the blooming trees and the lit city below, and the friends waiting for her, and the namestone where one more discarded soul waited to be told they were worth something after all. And she found that the grief she had carried 3 ages was still there, and always would be, and no longer weighed what it had once weighed. It had become, over the years and the love and the long good work, something she could carry, bittersweet and earned and quiet and at peace. "I think they would," she said softly, and she was smiling and her eyes were wet too. Yes, I think they would be." She took a breath of the spring air, and the old scholar's curiosity kindled in her. The joy in the next book, and the next word, and the next door opening onto worlds she had not yet seen, undimmed by everything, restored at last. "Come on then, Aunt Listen. There's someone waiting to find out what they are. Let's go and open the door." And she went, small and winged and unbroken, into the blooming grove to grant a calling. The deep that remembered, keeping the light, guarding the wall, at peace with her ghosts and glad of her friends and endlessly, joyfully curious about all the words the worlds still had left to give her. And behind her the restored city glowed, and above her the world was whole and guarded, and her parents were honored, and her long, strange labor of love went on.